Hi, my name is Laura Stoner, and we are here interviewing Stephen Van Grubb. It's August 11th, 2023, and we're on StreamYard. And we are talking about your dad's service in Vietnam and being a POW. And then ultimately you lost him in the war to the Vietnamese army. So can we start by you telling me what your full name is?
Yeah, my full name is Stephen William Grubb. I go by Van. That's a nickname.
And when were you born?
I was born April 6, 1963.
And what were your parents' names?
My mom was Evelyn Fowler Grubb. My dad was Wilmer Newlin Grubb, and he went by Nuke.
How did he get that name?
It was a nickname of my grandfather, and when my dad was flying, he flew the Starfighter at the time. They realized that Newlin and Wilmer weren't really a pilot's good name.
Uh-huh.
So he took over my grandfather's nickname, which was Nuke.
And where were you born?
I was born in Ramstein, or actually Landstuhl, which is an army base in Germany. My father was in Ramstein, but they didn't have a pediatric ward.
Mm-hmm. And your family both your mother and your father were from Pennsylvania normally when not in service?
Correct.
Okay. And what did your parents do for a living?
My mom and dad both were graduates of Penn State. And right after graduation, my father was in ROTC. He went right into the Air Force. And my mom was a stay-at-home mom raising boys.
And
I've got 3 brothers. My oldest brother was Jeff. He was born in Texas. Next was Roland. He was born in France, in Toul-Rosières, France. I came next, and then my youngest brother is Roy. He was born in Petersburg, Virginia.
And so your dad joined the military right after graduation, and had it been a lifelong motivation to fly?
Yeah, my aunt, my mom's sister, said that my dad had snuck out of the house when he was about 8 or 9 years old, took his allowance, and my aunt covered for him, and he went to a state fair and got onto a crop duster, and that was his first flight, and that's all he wanted to do was fly.
And he was stationed at Tan Son Nhut, right?
Correct.
And was that the main base that for the duration of the time that he was, before he was captured, where he served?
They did fly out of Thailand, and then when they had the Tan Son Nhut Air Base ready, that's when they transferred to Tan Son Nhut.
Okay. And how long did your dad serve before his plane went down?
My dad was in the Air Force for 11 years.
Okay. And then how long had he been in Vietnam, serving in Vietnam?
Little over 2 months.
Mm-hmm. And so your family heard initially through a telegram that your father's plane had gone down?
Correct. It was, we lived in Petersburg, Virginia at the time, and there was a snowstorm, a blizzard, and we had a foot of snow on the ground. It was January 26, 1966, and there was a knock on the door, and it was a taxi driver with the Western Union telegram. And my mom knew right away. Take it back. Go away. I know what it says. But that couldn't happen, and it was a telegram saying that he had been shot down and search was underway.
Did your mother know much of what he was doing in his flight missions prior to him, the
Yeah,
plane go down?
yeah, we did. My mom and dad and our family exchanged what they call living letters. And that's tape recordings that were sent back and forth. We'd do what was going on around our house, and we'd send the tape, and then he'd respond to what we had said and send it back to us.
Oh, did she keep those?
Yes, we have them.
Wow.
And the last one that we received would have been, my father would have done it on the day he was shot down.
Wow.
And he said that they knew he was coming. They had routes that they flew. And it's just a matter of time, he thought, until they got him.
So it was more, they knew the routes where they were moving like materials and supplies. And so they knew that the planes would be monitoring them along those routes, the Vietnamese.
Yeah, correct. My dad's shoot down was somewhat unique. It was during a Tet and Christmas bombing law. It wasn't a Tet offensive. It was a bombing law over the Christmas and Tet holiday season. No bombs had fallen over North Vietnam for a solid month. But my father had done 3 flights before he was shot down during that bombing law. He did a bunch of flights before that, but 3 during that bombing law.
And was his plane armed?
No, it was an unarmed reconnaissance mission. Anytime they flew over North Vietnam, they flew 2 identical aircraft. He was flying the F-101 Voodoo, and he had a wingman flying an identical aircraft. They did that in case somebody got shot down, they'd have coordinates for possible rescue.
And so when did the pictures of your father come out? How soon after you found out that he had been shot down?
Yeah, 20 days after shoot down, a friend of my father's from Altoona, Pennsylvania, called my mother and says, "Your husband's on the front page of our newspaper and he's been captured." And this is the photograph. This is the photograph that was released to the press right after, and we assumed that was right after capture. And this gave us great hope that he had survived the shoot down. He seemed to be in good health, and we were looking forward to seeing him again.
Did you know of any other POW pilots at the time that were in captivity? Like the Galanti and, like those were all, in the Hotel Hanoi.
Well, of course, we heard about the people getting shot down, but we didn't. The Air Force wasn't real good about getting the families in touch with one another. The Navy was real good about that. They allowed the families to correspond, work out any problems that they may have with buying houses, buying cars. It was a different time. Women didn't have that sort of power to do those sort of purchases without their husbands. Okay.
Yeah. And they're earning, potential behind them.
Correct. Yeah.
So you were in Petersburg because your mother wanted to be near family?
Yeah, my grandmother lived in Petersburg, and when my dad went over to Vietnam, we wanted to be near family. There were 3 of us at the time, and my mom was pregnant with my youngest brother, Roy. It was, when we got the news, she was 3 months pregnant, and gave birth to Roy 6 months after my father was shot down.
And so she felt like he was still alive at that time.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So and then I saw that on your questionnaire, the pre-interview questionnaire, that you said your family moved around a lot. So where did you guys go after Petersburg?
We went to Colonial Heights, which is just above Petersburg, between Petersburg and Richmond, Virginia.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, that's where my mom bought a house. We had 4 boys. We were living in a smaller place and didn't have enough bedrooms, so my mom purchased her first house.
And was she able to do that easily, or because it was assumed that he would know? Okay.
No, it was not an easy thing. They said, you think your husband would be okay with this? And she said, well, yes, he's a POW. Well, can't you call him? Make sure this is the house that he wants. And said, well, no, you can't really call the prisoners. So it wasn't, but she found a builder that would comply, and so she got the house built. But it wasn't easy being a woman back then. It wasn't easy being a woman.
And did the military compensate your mother at a rate? Like, I know that sometimes you could pick a percentage to send home, and dependents got a certain amount of money of the paycheck of the military member. But I just wonder, like, him being a POW, how their financial setup, if the military was helpful to her during that time.
The military was helpful, but my father, before he had gone over to Vietnam, had set up a separate account to put money in to buy a boat. And my mom now had 4 boys and needed his full pay, and actually had to go to Congress and was interviewed by congressmen about why she needed her full pay. And one congressman actually said, what have you done to deserve your husband's full pay? And that was a keystone moment for my mom to get active, to be a activist for the POW MIA movement.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I just can't imagine how much she must have been going through, let alone you know what I mean? Like that on top of everything else that she was dealing with must have been so stressful.
Yeah, well, she got a phone call one day in May of 1968, 2 years after my father was shot down. It was a military wife. She was a Navy wife, and her name was Mrs. Crow. Mrs. Crow told my mom there is going to be a meeting with POW wives, and we understand that you are an Air Force wife, but you're more than welcome to come. We'd like to introduce you and make you a part of our little group.
Mm-hmm. So, but I want to go back. Your mom did have a master. She went to school for teaching, and then she got a master's degree. So she's got some advanced education going on in all of this too, right?
Yes, she did. Master's in art education.
But did she ever teach, or?
She wanted to teach. My father and my mother was a year ahead of my father in school, and so she got out of school earlier, and when they were in Pennsylvania, and she wanted to teach, but there wasn't an available position at that time.
Mm-hmm.
And then she went with my father to Texas when he graduated for flight training school, and by that time she was pregnant and started to have a family. So she became a stay-at-home mom for the boys.
So the time that she did her testimony in Congress, and then this 1968 phone call with the Navy women of POWs wives, that was kind of her polarizing moment of like how she wanted to be an advocate, and then she kind of met this group that would help her find her voice.
Yeah, She had done TV interviews about the shoot down and in Petersburg before the Navy wives meeting.
Mm-hmm. Well, how did she feel like how it was going? And at the point that she met the Navy wives, was she frustrated at that point?
Yeah, they had certain channels that were supposed to be allowed to get and receive mail in case your husband or wife at the time had been captured through the Red Cross. It was a part of the Geneva Conventions. And the military gave us an address that was supposed to be used so that could be so, but they'd always come back non-deliverable, and packages would come back non-deliverable, which was not unusual.
Mm-hmm.
Not a whole lot of women were getting any mail from their loved one in Vietnam.
So when did the POW MIA movement really get going? And they made the flag and.
Yeah, and like I said, the first meeting that she attended was in 1968, and the founding member was Sybil Stockdale. She was in California, and by 1969, 1970, they realized that if they were going to make any changes with the way the government was interacting with these POW missing in action women, that they needed an office in Washington, D.C. And so my mom, we lived in Petersburg. It was close, and she'd travel up to Washington and help set up the first office in Washington, D.C. in 1970. And then that's when the name, the National League of Families, POW MIA, Missing in Southeast Asia, came to be. At first, it was just called the Navy Wives.
Mm-hmm. But it was more inclusive.
It was more inclusive. It was a lot more men were coming up missing, last seen alive, but never made any list on the POW status.
So were the families, the POW families versus the MIA families, were they pretty united in their cause, or was there a different feeling? Because I'm sure a lot of missing in action people were killed, but like POWs, they had that big release of POWs at a certain point, so yeah. They were more hopeful.
They were welcomed with open arms. My father never made a list of a prisoner of war, despite the pictures of him being captured. The Vietnamese never put him on any list, and so my father was POW and missing in action.
So how is your family functioning at this time? Because you don't have, your father is not with you, and your mother's being a single parent, but she's also very involved in this, job to promote POWs and MIA soldiers. How is, you're very young, right? You're the third youngest.
Yeah, the day I was almost 3 when my father was shot down. 3 months shy of being, 2.5 months shy of being 3 years old, and my grandmother really chipped in and helped out quite a bit. She was supportive of the league, but felt that mom was spending a lot of time being with the league. And in 1971, my mom became the national coordinator. We lived in Petersburg, Virginia, and that meant she would have to be in Washington, D.C. pretty much full time. So she went to the commandant of Fort Lee, Virginia, Army base, and asked if there was a couple that would watch us during the week, and she would come home during the weekends. And we had a wonderful, wonderful people. Bruce and Sharon Carlson was their name.
Mhm.
And they became a second mom and dad to us for almost 2 years.
Did they have their own children or just your
No,
childhood?
they were 20 years old. And they took on the responsibility of watching 4 boys.
Wow. So did you enjoy living in Fort Lee for the weeks?
They were able to stay with us at our home in Colonial Heights at that
Oh,
time.
okay. Uh-huh.
So that gave them a chance to live off base. And
Rent free.
yeah, so it was rent free and all the food was paid for. And they were just wonderful people. And we're still in touch with them to this day. They're just great. They're like Bruce was the first father figure that I remembered.
Yeah. Yeah. But those, when I think back of those, the live letters, I mean, those must be so cherished by your family because, it kind of reinforces the memory of your father being a father,
Yeah. Yeah, I only have just vague recollections of my father. I was just 2 years old, and but I do remember listening to the tapes now. I remember talking about this stuff, and that's when he was still alive in Vietnam. So talking about having chicken pox.
He got chicken pox in Vietnam?
No, I did.
Oh, you were talking about it.
And my dad sending the reply, don't itch those chicken pox because that will be bad.
Yeah.
So I do remember, that having the chicken pox and hearing the letters.
Yeah.
It brought him close when he was so far away.
Yeah. Yeah. So your mom goes and she's the head of the group in DC, and you and your brothers are living in Colonial Heights. How is that? She served 2 years. You said 2 years she would have to be in DC?
Yeah, she had a 1 year term every year that they voted, but she spent a lot of time up there. She was a board member after her term ended. I don't know if you're ready for this, but in 1970, a communist sympathizer came back from Vietnam with the list of 5 men that had died in captivity. And my dad's name was on that list. Now, 4 years had passed, and they utilized the pictures of my dad after capture for 4 years, almost 5 years, on the humane treatment of the POWs, which gave us hope, hey, they're still using these pictures. He must still be alive.
Yeah.
So when they returned the list, my mom went to Congress and said, if we believe that my husband's dead after 4 years of utilizing these pictures of him on the humane treatment of the POWs, there will be no reason to keep any of them alive, especially the ones that never made a list. They'll kill them all. There'll be no reason to keep them alive at this point. And our government agreed, and we still had hope that he was alive. This woman could travel freely back and forth in North Vietnam, and we, the men from the League, or nobody else could. So why should we believe her?
Yeah. So that was probably a really upsetting development either way, because it just kind of made it unclear as to what was going on.
Yeah, it made it very confusing. But we weren't the only ones. By this time in the war, 1970, 1971, you had over 500 confirmed POWs and 5,000 missing in action family members. And missing in action means they were last seen alive, whether the units had to pull out because of heavy fire and somebody got left behind. That's what a missing in action family member was. They were last seen alive and in good health.
So, in retrospect, of the men that were on that communist sympathizers list, were all of them dead in reality? Had all of them died? Or were any of the people living that were on the list?
No, all of the men that were on that list had died.
Hmm.
But we didn't know for sure until a year after the war was over. They returned my dad's remains along with 23 other men that had died in captivity.
Mm-hmm.
You know, my mom was super active in the league. She met with Kissinger. She met with Nixon. She was the liaison during the Paris peace talks between the government and the family members.
Mm-hmm.
Super active.
And Kissinger wrote the foreword in her book.
Yes.
That she wrote about her experience.
Yeah.
You are not forgotten.
That was very honored for Kissinger to do that. And she had met with him, so he remembered my mom, called her one of the bravest women her and Sybil Stockdale were two of the bravest women that he had ever met. And Nixon agreed.
Yeah. So you and your brothers were also very involved in the POW MIA movement, and your brother had talked a lot at one time about the family's experience, and he was old enough to remember your dad, right?
Correct. That would be Jeff. Jeff was the oldest. He gave speeches. He actually wrote a letter to the president, got a reply. He was the most active because he was the oldest. But as we grew up, we were all doing parts. We all attended functions in Washington, D.C. And it was amazing the amount of people that got behind these functions. It was incredible. The Washington Redskins would host a Christmas party for the POW and the MIA children that were in the area. Johnny Unitas got behind us. The Jets got behind us. We even had Jackie Onassis attend one of the events.
Oh, wow. But how did you feel about your role as being a boy, but also being the son of a POW? And after finding out that he had died, there's still kind of like, you have life to do. You got to be your own person. Like, how did it feel to have to navigate life with that your family had such a burden of this advocacy? You know what I mean? Like, I don't know if I'm saying this right, but I'm saying that it's kind of like when someone dies, you don't want to, when you're out in the open, you don't want to talk about it because, it's kind of like a downer. So, you learn to kind of like, you wanted, like, on one side, people kind of like, sometimes they develop like a personality so that they don't have to deal with what's going on in their life in reality. Do you know what I mean? Like, they kind of split their.
We didn't know he was truly dead until 1974. Early, we'd talk about it, but once his body was returned and repatriated and buried at Arlington, we moved to Florida to get away from Washington, D.C. We had moved to Maryland after we had lived in Colonial Heights.
Mm-hmm.
About 1972, 73, we moved there because that was closer to Arlington.
Mm-hmm.
And but once he came home and we moved to Florida, we had to start over. If we did talk about it, a lot of times the responses weren't good. I had one of my best friends, he was talking about his dad. His dad had served in World War II, on a bomber, and he was telling about some of his heroic missions that he had done, and I had shared that my dad was a POW in Vietnam, and he looked at me and said, well, we shouldn't have been there anyway. Well, from having gone through so much, I ran out of the house and crying, got home. My mom noticed I was upset and asked what had happened. And I told her, and next time I went over to my friend's house, he said, I talked to my dad, and if you want to call my dad, Dad, you can.
Oh.
It was a very unpopular war. But on the other hand, we went to an air show one time, and there was a voodoo on the tarmac, and I was standing in front of it, and a serviceman came up and said that was the plane that my dad used to fly, and looked at me and said he must have been a very brave man. So the servicemen understand, even to this day. The veterans have gotten behind my project to try to sell my mom's book, and they really understand. And I think there's been an awakening about Vietnam with the general public. The reception that our troops got wasn't good when they came home.
Yeah.
And I think people realize that now. And now you see these vets with their Vietnam hats and their shirts, and people will come up and say how proud they are of them and thank them for their service. And they didn't get that when they came home.
Yeah. I do think that the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, I think, kind of have taught the American public that conflicts are very complicated things. And World War II was almost an exception in that it was such a clear cut, like that's bad and this was good, and good triumphed over evil. And I think it's just way more complicated in these days and times. And I think people realize that the service members were trying to go and do their job. That was their job, and they were sacrificing for us. So you gotta give them.
And the media didn't do them any service either. During Vietnam, they were, called baby killers. And during the Tet Offensive in Vietnam, Walter Cronkite got on top of the Rex restaurant in Saigon and said, the war is over. We've lost the war. Well, the Tet Offensive, yeah, it was a successful for the Vietnamese, but we had beat them back. And the media didn't do a service to the servicemen. Mm-hmm. They portrayed them as baby killers, and it was just a very unpopular war. And I think if we would have won the war, maybe the men would have came home and been treated better. But the way the war ended was not a good way. And then to have Saigon fall shortly thereafter, it made a lot of people upset that, well, what did we give 58,000 men's lives for? Mm-hmm. It was a very tough time. But lately, people really, really have gotten behind the vets and the Gold Star family members, which is what I am. That's what I've got here is a Gold Star on, which is a pin.
Yeah.
Gold Star means that my father was killed in combat or in a theater of war. And this is my dad's 20th Tactical Recon Squadron shirt. We wore this when we walked in my father's footsteps when we went to Vietnam.
So you got an offer to go to Vietnam from a Vietnamese citizen, right?
Yes, we did.
Can you tell me about that?
Yeah, it's before that, my mom had written her book, You Were Not Forgotten, with Carol Jose, and unfortunately, the book was completed, but it wasn't published by the time my mom passed away. I just want to talk about the book a little bit.
Oh, sure.
And Carol Jost did a real good job selling as many copies of the book as she did.
Mm-hmm.
But she passed away several years later. And I think she passed away in 2017 or 18 or 19. And she had sold a bunch of books, and she devoted the rest of her life. The book took 5 years to write. You know, I had to go through the National Archives, had to check every detail to make sure it was accurate. And but she passed away, and I had gone to the publisher after she had passed and wanted to pick up some copies of the books, had some interest. And I asked the publisher how much has sold in the last couple of years. And this was during COVID. And he said, well, with COVID, last 2 years, we've sold 8 copies of the book. Mm. And I said, well, I'm going to change that. So I picked up 4 cases of books that day. And just so happens that when I got back, we had the Vietnam moving wall came to a park near us, Wickham Park, about 2 miles from my house. So I went out there, and not to sell books, but to just get a feel of if they sell. And I got to talking to the people under the tents selling stuff, and got to this one tent, and they're talking to the person selling stuff, and next to him was a friend of theirs, excuse me, and she was dressed as the Statue of Liberty. And I was explaining about the book, and the lady came up and said, you know, you got an amazing story. Can I hear what you got to say? So I talked to her for about a half an hour. At the end, she said, have you ever spoken publicly? I said, well, we did speeches at Arlington when I was a kid, but it's been 40 years, but I'm not afraid. And she actually had me go to Orlando during the week of remembrance for the POWs, excuse me, in September. And that was my first public speaking event. And it was at a very large venue. And walked in, and the mayor was there, and the mayor's advisory council, and TV cameras. And I went, oh my Lord, what did I get myself into? And it was supposed to be a 15-minute speech, and the poor lady be at the back of the room, keep me on track. I sort of forgot about her, and when I did notice her, she was like, 2 minutes, 2 minutes. And I went, I'm only halfway through, and then I look up, she's like, 1 minute, 1 minute. And then pretty soon she's in the back waving her arms, and like she's bringing in a plane onto an aircraft carrier. And I wasn't done. And she sat down, and I spoke for 28 minutes. And at the end, I got a standing ovation. And the mayor said, I'm glad you finished your speech. But it was this man, he was probably in his 80s, maybe a little older. He was Korea War vet and fought in Vietnam as well. He said, I've been to hundreds of these events to remember the men that died with us. And he goes, that was one of the best speeches that I've ever heard. Mm-hmm. I spoke from my heart. I got a story, and it's a good story, and it's not over. But
did you feel like you were walking in your mom's footsteps at that time?
I think my mom and dad were guiding me. I wasn't walking. You know, we were religious growing up, and I was always told that God's got a purpose for every person. And if you follow God's lead, things will work out. So I've just been following God's lead. He's leading me, and I'm just following. And it's been remarkable. Hmm. I look in the background here. I neglected to mention the flag.
She helped with the design, right? Or helped it be designed.
She was the national coordinator. Mary Hoff lived in Maryland, or lived in Florida. And it's very uncertain how it came to be, but she was given the job. You know, we had advertising agency when the league was started. They said you need buttons, you need postcards, you need bumper stickers, you need a banner. And Mary Hoff got the job to do the banner. She went to Amon's Flag Company first, and she was referred to Newt Hinesley. Hinesley was a private contractor, and he's the one that designed the flag. When it came to the league, it came in paper form, and it came with colored plastic sheets. You remember the overhead projectors?
Yeah.
And you could put the plastic sheets that were colored, and it would have a blue background or a green background or a red background. And the women all agreed that the black and white flag, the original design, was the one, because the POW and MIA issue should be a black and white issue. And that flag stood out. They went to other functions and other events, and there were flags flying, and they all had colors and fancy designs, and this was the only one that they knew of that was black and white at the time. So it really stood out, but they had no idea it would become what it has become today.
Yeah, it's an amazingly iconic design.
I think it gives all servicemen hope, knowing that if they were to be captured or lost somewhere, that they wouldn't be forgotten. I think that's it. It super exceeds what it was originally designed to do, which was to fly until the men were either came home or the missing were all accounted for. And that still hasn't happened. There's still over 1,500 men to this day whose families are waiting for any information.
So did your mother serve with the league until her death, or?
No, she served until my father's remains were returned in 1974. There was an agreement with the women that if your man was repatriated, alive or dead, you were allowed to leave the league. You weren't required, but you were allowed to. And my mom was raising 4 boys, and it had been 8 years. And it was time to move on. We had to start over. You can't just keep living that life and be productive. She wanted us to be productive men. She didn't want us to live our lives with in the shadow of that. You know, the military, when my father's remains were returned and buried in Arlington, it was under full military funeral. He got to go through the Hero's Arch. There was a flyover, a missing man flyover. There was the taps. There was the presentation of the flag. The military did a great thing, and that was the closing of a door, and we needed another door to open.
Yeah.
And that's why we moved to Florida, to start over. You know, my mom didn't really talk to anybody about what she did with the league when we moved to Florida, the new friends that she met. And people said, "What happened to your husband? You're a widow." And she said, "Well, he was lost in Vietnam," and just left it at that.
So she didn't tell them about her role. And
No. Yeah, it brings back terrible memories. You know, our outcome wasn't what we thought it was going to be. You know, for 5 years using the pictures of him, we assumed that he was going to come back alive. And what we found out when my dad's remains were returned, they put a date of death on his death certificate of 9 days after capture. And that's hard when the first pictures were released 20 days after capture. So when they released those pictures 20 days after capture, he was already a dead man, and then utilized them for 5 years on the humane treatment of the POWs.
Yeah.
So when people say war is hell and sacrifices have been made, that's sort of what they're talking about. It's war is never meant to be a pleasant thing. We've made it a little more pleasant by the bombs that are more accurate, or having rules of engagement, but it's a terrible, terrible thing. And sacrifice is is what I want to do to remind people. It's taken me a long time to get to this point to where I can talk about my father without bursting into tears, although I still do sometimes when I'm speaking publicly. Uh, it's a difficult thing. We never got any mental health help with our struggle. It wasn't offered by the military. There's a fellow Gold Star family member who's working that right now in Congress. Try to get us adult children some mental health.
Yeah.
It's you think, well, it's been 40 years, you should be over it, but nah, it's always there.
It stays
It's just,
with you.
we'll never be cured. We heal, but we'll never be cured.
Yeah, definitely. Well, it seems like they were kind of behind in even offering it to the service members, and that they've kind of gotten on the mental health train now, but I'm sure, getting it out to the families will take longer.
Yeah, those poor men come
Yeah.
home and just try to go right back into normal civilization. It must have been very, very well. We know it was very difficult and didn't work out so well for so many of them.
Yeah, absolutely. So, did you go to college after you graduated high school? Like, what did
Yeah,
you?
yeah. I actually went to DeVry Institute of Technology in Atlanta, Georgia.
Oh. Uh-huh.
Became electronic technician. Worked at Harris for almost 5 years. We were in the satellite communications division. We monitored NBC TV and built satellite dishes, maintained satellite dishes. And then the first shuttle blew up, and guess what? We weren't shooting up anymore. Satellites.
Uh-huh.
We went from 580 people in our division, and when I got my pink slip, we were down to 40.
Wow.
And I thought I had done real, real well staying as long as I did until I went out and looked for a job locally and realized there were 500 people before me who had already applied. So I became a painter for a little while, and I was painting a complex, and one of the men on the scaffolding got hurt, and it was a 6-story job, and I was a ground man. I was keeping the men on the scaffolding and painting downstairs balconies, and the boss man said, "Okay, man, you're up." And I said, "Well, I don't mind going 6 stories in the air, but you got to pay me what you paid that man." He said, "Well, maybe the next job." And I looked around. We got a quarter of the way through this job, and I went, "Nah, that's not going to work." He goes, "Well, if you don't like it, you're going to have to leave." Well, I walked off the job, and that night the maintenance man for the condominium called me and said, "I saw what you did for that man. You worked hard. Come and talk to me in the morning." So I went and talked to him in the morning before the painter showed up, and he said, "Well, what sort of work do you know how to do? I know you know how to paint." And I said, "Well, I know irrigation. We had a pool growing up when we moved to Florida. Know how to keep your pool. I know how to do your irrigation system. No painting, miscellaneous carpentry." And he said, "Well, I'm going to give you a shot. I've been looking for a good assistant." And before I walked out, he said, "Keep an eye on those painting guys." I walked out, and the painting boss was there. He said, "What are you doing here? You don't work for me anymore." And I said, "I know, I'm your new boss." And I've been doing the condo maintenance ever since. I really enjoy it.
Okay, so can we talk about your trip to Vietnam?
Oh, yeah. In My brother was in 2013. He was contractor in Afghanistan, and he had some time in between his 12-hour shifts, and he had not a whole lot to do there. So he went on the Arlington Cemetery website, and there you can download pictures of your loved one on their page. He went on my dad's page and clicked the picture, and there was an Asian man popped up in front of my mom and dad's tombstone with the Vietnamese American dictionary in his lap. And you click the next picture, and he's at the wall at my dad's panel. And he messaged me, he messaged Carol Jost, the co-author of my mom's book, and my other two brothers, and said, "Who is this guy?" And almost a year went by before Carol Jost called me one day and said, very excitedly, "We think we know who the man is that came and visited your mom and dad at Arlington. Somebody's coming from Washington, D.C., would like to meet you." So we went to Carol Joseph, my younger brother, Roy, and myself, and met this man. He's an American. He's done TV, he's done movies, but he's also produced a couple documentaries, and his name's Kevin Settle. Kevin Settles has another producer that had done work with him, and his fiance at the time, they're married now, her father fought for South Vietnam. His name is My Pham. At the end of the war, My Pham was held in a re-education camp in Vietnam for 10 years, and when he got out, he realized he was under house arrest, still couldn't do anything, and did one of those terrible boat lifts out of Vietnam, but eventually ended up in Alexandria, Virginia, and had been there 25 years. And he wanted to see his brother who had fought from the North. He had three brothers. My mom had three brothers. Two fought for the North, two fought for the South. It divided their family. So they brought one of the brothers who fought for the North. His name's Pham. And Pham, they had a great family reunion. A lot of fun was had. And they had one day they weren't doing anything, and they asked Pham what he wanted to do. "We're in America. What do you want to do?" And he replied, "I want to find Grubb." "Grubb? Who's Grubb? You don't know anybody in America." And he replied that he did. He said Grubb was the first pilot our anti-aircraft unit shot down during the war, and we captured him. And Pham and Michael Chiplock is the man whose fiance, father who fought for the South. Michael Chiplock went online and found out my dad had died in captivity from wounds sustained from the ejection of the aircraft. And Pham didn't like that because my father was uninjured from the ejection of his aircraft. You know, the picture of him after capture with the nurse working on his knee, we found out that was sustained after he had been captured. He had ejected on top of a mountaintop, and they sent up a search team and found him. First found the parachute laid out as a homing beacon, and found my father about a quarter kilometer on top of the mountain with one path up and one path down, with brush pulled over him between two rocks, and his legs were hanging out. They told him in French to drop his weapon. The only weapon he had was a revolver. His plane was unarmed, and he complied. And they stripped him down to his underwear, make sure he had no homing beacons, took his shoes off as well as his rubber-soled boots, and marched him down the mountain. He slipped and fell, and that's the only injury he got, was a scraped knee. Nothing life-threatening at all.
Do you know if he received any kind of prisoner of war training prior to going to Vietnam?
Oh, yeah, they all did. All those men that were recon pilots and pilots, they all had training.
Okay.
And my dad spoke French and he spoke Russian, and that came in very handy when he was in Vietnam.
Okay, so they took him down the mountain. The villagers took him down the mountain.
Yeah, so UFOM Duck, what had happened when UFOM found out my dad had died in captivity, he went and paid respects at Arlington and went to the wall and posted pictures on the website that we had found. And UFOM got back to Vietnam and realized my family had no idea what had happened to my dad after he had been shot down, and spoke to his other teammates. It was the C4 anti-aircraft weaponry group. And they realized, they wrote us a letter. And wrote us a letter, said, if you were on January, it sort of went like this. January 26, 1966, we shot the plane of Grubb down and captured him. We have stories of Grubb. If family members or anybody wants to come in to Vietnam, we will treat them well. And he signed it UFOM Duck. And Kevin delivered that letter, and my first reply was my mom would be on the next plane.
Mm-hmm.
It's information. We'd waited 50 years for information, and but wasn't really sure. We had talked to other two brothers, and I was still on the fence about that. So I called the one person that I thought may have an answer for me, and that was Alan Brunstrom. And he was my dad's wingman the day my dad was shot down.
Mm-hmm.
Alan Brunstrom was also shot down 4 months later and spent 6 years and 10 months in the Hanoi Hilton and the zoo and those terrible prisoner of war camps.
Wow.
And it was released alive at the end of the war and became a family friend. And I called Al. I gave him a brief description of why we would go to Vietnam. And I said, well, Al, what do you think? And he says, well, Van, I think it would do you good. I went back. I went, why would you go back after spending 6 years and 10 months in hell and were you treated so badly? He said, well, Van, I wanted to see what the country looked like outside the wall.
Mm-hmm.
And he said, I went, I had a good time. It was good for me. I think you should go too. So my brothers and I agreed, and we spent 3 weeks walking in my dad's footsteps in Vietnam.
You and all three of your brothers?
Yeah, yes. All three of my brothers went. My younger brother, Roy, brought his son, Eli. He was 8 or 9 years old at the time. And Roland was married to a Thai woman. And he got leave, and Thailand's right next door. So she came with us as well. And Kevin said, Kevin Settle, when he delivered the letter, said, if you want to go and make this happen and just go by yourselves, we'll make all the connections happen. But he said, I've done documentaries before, and this is a fascinating story. I would like to bring a crew. And that was another decision. If we go, do we bring the crew? And my mom was very organized with the League of Families. She kept every note that she wrote during meetings, phone calls. I've got 3 big bins filled with notes.
Wow.
For meetings. And that helped immensely with writing the book as well.
Yeah.
So I said, well, Mom was so documented with everything she did, we should document this too. So we agreed to bring a film crew when we went.
So what was your greatest fear about going to Vietnam?
Greatest fear would be how are we going to be approached by the general population of Vietnam. Mm-hmm. We weren't doing a tour. We weren't getting on a bus and just going to tourist destinations. We were flying in sort of incognito and spending time with the men from the unit that shot my dad down. Unwarranted fear. I never once had a problem with any of the general population. I get up at 5 o'clock every morning, and no matter where we went, Hanoi, Saigon, now Ho Chi Minh City, they're roosters. People had kept their livestock. Apartment complexes, they'd be out on the back balconies. So roosters wake you up every morning at 5, I go out and sit with the general population. They have for breakfast, instead of eggs and bacon like we do here, they have pho or pho, their Vietnamese soup. And never once had a person come up and say, "You dirty American, you're responsible for my loved one's death." No, never once. If they could speak English and they approached us and asked us if we were Americans, and we said yes, they'd say, "Can we get a picture with you? We love America. We want to go to America." And it was very surprising that they had put it behind them so well.
So what was the biggest surprise that you received from that trip?
There's so many things. For a month before I went, I was given the job. My dad didn't stay on base. His squadron, the 20th Tactical Recon Squadron, stayed off base at a large house or an apartment not a complex, just a large house. And I was given the job to try to find that house, and I contacted men from the unit. I got a couple pictures of the house and address. Well, unbeknownst to me, for a month I was looking for the wrong address because after the war, all the names of the roads had changed. And got to Vietnam, and now actually before I got to Vietnam, about a couple days before we went, I got the right address and went online and on Google Earth, and I was able to zoom in on this address, and it looked like a parking lot. When we got to Vietnam, one of the first stops we did after we got settled in, and Kevin says, "UFOM's got a surprise for you." And we got on a taxi, and a large van, but it was taxi, and pulled up in front of the house. It looked like a parking lot because a pole barn had been built over the entire house. So when you look down from above, it looked like a parking lot. But the house was scheduled for demolition. It had a fence over it. But I could tell from the pictures that I received, it had special window coverings. It had bars on the wall. It had special tile on the floor, and you could see it all. The brick pattern on the outside of the house was the same. And that was a big moment, That's the place my dad left that day, and Al Brunstrom came home without him that night. That was our starting point. There's so many things. We went to the battlefield where my dad was shot down. That was a very difficult meeting. But one of the UFOM Duck, the man that came to America, invited us to America. He was not a member of the anti-aircraft unit when my father was shot down. He joined later. But at the end of the war, he became a history teacher. And in being a history teacher, he also became the historian for the C4 anti-aircraft weaponry group. So history is very important to him. So we met UFOM when we got to Saigon. The first person that we met who was with the anti-aircraft weaponry group when my father was shot down, his name was Mr. Me, and we met him in Dong Hoi province. We had a meeting with Mr. Me in his house, and that's when we got the first-hand account of how they shot my father down. And there wasn't a dry eye in the house. Us boys were crying. The Vietnamese men were crying. The cameramen were crying. And before my mom had died, we got to talk. She was terminal cancer, and the good and bad gave us a chance to say our love, goodbyes, and say anything that we wanted to her. And we're discussing her death one day, and And she said, you know, if God would be so great to let me become a flying creature and fly over this world and see the most beautiful things, I'd be so grateful. And we're having this terrible meeting with the man, and we're all crying, and through the front door came a big butterfly and flew around us boys twice and went right back out the door. And all my brothers knew about my mom wanting to be a flying creature after death. And we couldn't take our eyes off the butterfly. We realized, yeah, this is probably one of those beautiful things Mom would have wanted to see.
Mm-hmm.
You know, we felt my mom and dad's presence quite a bit when we were in Vietnam. Being a Christian family, we do have our beliefs, and one of those beliefs is sometimes messengers can come. And quite a few times that happened to us while we were there.
Yeah. So poignant. What else did you get to do in Vietnam that had to do with your father's capture? Like, did they take you to the mountain where he ejected from the plane?
Yeah, we went to the battlefield, and that's there's 5 members of the group that were there that day. That 5 or 6 members. It was Son Truc in Dong Hoi province. It was a river crossing on the Ho Chi Minh Trail, which we had no idea where he'd been shot down or what his mission was. It was a river crossing during the Tet bombing law, Christmas bombing law. They wanted to see what sort of troop movement had been on the Ho Chi Minh Trail.
Mm-hmm.
And they could tell by photographs what sort of tire tracks were on either side of the river. They utilized small boats. They tied them together in order to get equipment across the river. And a quarter-kilometer away on that river was a river cave. And they kept the boats in the river cave during the daytime and took them out at night to move equipment across the river. So we went to Son Truc, where the anti-aircraft weaponry was a small hill on the outside of town. The foxholes were still somewhat visible when we visited the battlefield, and each man that was there that day stood in their little foxholes and explained how they shot my dad down. Said the planes had been over that area before. They just aimed their anti-aircraft weaponry in the part of the sky that the planes normally flew. The spotter who first spotted the planes through his binoculars was trained in Russia on how to shoot down aircraft. And he just told the men to wait. And then when they got in that perfect spot, they all opened fire. They said my dad's plane broke into 2 pieces. The tail went over 2 mountaintops, landed in a rice paddy. The front of the plane went up into the clouds, or headed towards the clouds, but you can't control an aircraft without a tail. And saw the parachute. And he ejected and landed on, he went over 2 terrible mountaintops. If he would have landed there, he'd have tumbled. There was no flat spot. He happened to land on the only flat spot on top of the 3rd mountain. It was surreal to stand there with the men that were responsible for my dad's shoot down and listen to them, how they explained it. And I asked them, what did you do when you hit the plane? And they went, hooray! And I had to say, well, and my dad was going, oh my God, I'm in so much trouble now. It's the worst day of my life. It was the best day of their war, the worst day of my dad's life. You had to know that it wasn't going to be good. They like I said, they found my dad's parachute. They knew he had landed on that 3rd mountaintop and sent up a search team and found him huddled between 2 boulders with brush pulled over him, and he complied when he was asked to drop his weapon, and marched him down the mountaintop and took him to house closest to the mountains where the bombs rarely fell. We were able to go to that house. The people at the house are still there. The man was military, and the wife and him lived in the house, and they guarded him overnight, fed him, said they'd never seen a man eat so much in his life. They have fed him they didn't think he'd eat, but they were trained when you ever get a chance to eat after captivity, eat as much as you can. You never know when your next meal is going to be. So he did what he was trained to do. He complied. He ate as much as he could. They kept him captive overnight until the higher authorities came to him approximately 3 or 4 o'clock in the morning. The following morning. And that was the last of the anti-aircraft unit saw my father.
And was that the end of the path that you were able to follow for his experience? No. Okay.
No, no, it was not. From Son Trucks, Dong Hoi province, we traveled to Hanoi. We did a train to Hanoi. Well, before we got on the train, my brothers and I wanted to try to climb that mountain. And my oldest brother, Jeff, and my next brother, Roland, getting a little old for that. But Roy and I gave it our best shot, but it had been raining previously for 4 days. And it was steep and a lot of loose rock. And we got 3/4 of the way up, and it looked like it was going to rain again. And we had to catch a train to Hanoi, and we were just out of time. And I had to call Roy down, and Roy and Eli were a little higher than I was. And we almost made it to the top, and I called Roy down. He came down with Eli, and we were saying our prayers, laying flowers that we had picked at the base of the mountain to lay as respect to my dad. And Roy was upset, I wanted to really get to the top of the mountain, we've been all this way, and when's an opportunity like this going to happen again? And just then 2 butterflies flew up the mountain, and went around us, and went back down the mountain. And I said, Roy, there's Mom and Dad. They wouldn't want us to get hurt rushing to get to the top of this mountain. We've got more important things to do than that. It's one of those beautiful things that I think they both wanted to see and reassure us that we were okay and to go down. So from Son Truck, we took a train to Hanoi. The first stop that we did was the Hanoi Hilton. We believe that's where my dad would have probably taken his last breath. After capture in 1970, they did forced confessions to a lot of the men. They break them down, but through torture and techniques, and make them do audio confessions on how they were bad for bombing or taking pictures or flying over their country. And one of those was my dad's audio confession that was played over the Hanoi radio, and also played over the radio at the Hanoi Hilton. We believe that was released 6 or 7 days after he'd have been captured. And that's why we're pretty sure that in order to get him to do that, Al Brunstrom, my dad's wingman, said your dad's shoot down was unique, and the men that were in charge of the torture weren't good at what they did. They didn't know how far they can push the human body before they killed him. And Al agreed that he was probably pushed too far in order to make that forced confession. Because it didn't sound like my dad. And 2 had been made. Al Brunstrom heard one when he was first captured. He heard 1 forced confession from a previous pilot, and then the tape clicked, and then he heard, my name's Captain Wilmer Newlin Grubb. And the man hit the stop button on it. They played it for Al to show him that he'd be making one of these too. And Al said, I want to hear that. And he asked, why? And goes, well, I know that man. But the one that was played over the Hanoi radio said Wilmer N. Grubb. He didn't use his middle name. So he had made two of them. One probably was not as good as the other. I don't know why they would utilize one over the other. But the torture, having been a friend with Al, when I was in Vietnam and discussing the one argument I had with UFOM the whole time we were there was about torture. We had gone to a museum and showed pictures of Americans with severed heads and ears and pushing men out of helicopters and those type of museums. And I told him, torture happened on both sides, UFOM. And he said, oh no, we not torture. And I was telling this to Al Brunston, and Al Brunston finished the sentence. He said, yeah, we don't torture, we punish. And that's what they told the Vietnamese, that they weren't torturing men, they were punishing them. And the Al Brunstrom, I won't get descriptive, but Al Brunstrom gave me a description of one of the techniques of punishment. It was torture. Bad, bad, bad. There's no, people would go, oh, these forced confessions. I would never do that. You don't know how bad the torture was. Every man has a breaking point, and every man met that breaking point, believe me.
Yeah.
Hanoi, we did the Hanoi Hilton. Most people would think Hanoi Hilton, it was a Hilton. No, it was actually a French prison camp before Vietnam. French utilized it to hold prisoners of Vietnamese that they didn't agree with. It was a prison camp long before it was used as a prisoner of war camp during Vietnam. Very small cells. Most of it had been destroyed. There's really the facade of the front of the building's all that's left. They tore it down for development. Not a whole lot to see there. Small cells. But we were able to pay respects to my dad, where we think he took his last breath. And then after, before my dad's remains were returned, there were pictures that were brought back from Vietnam. They had brought the 23 men that had died in captivity and all put them in a communal cemetery. I'm not sure if you can see this well. There's 23 men buried under each one in that little lot. And in each man had a tombstone made for identification. We wanted to find where the graveyard was. We were told it was near an old French graveyard on the outside of Hanoi. The Vietnamese men from the C-4 anti-aircraft unit researched, and we're pretty sure that they had found the location. So we all took a big van there, only to find out that the French cemetery had been moved for development. But we were there, so I took out the pictures, and we were walking through this little town, and I was showing pictures to anybody that wanted to see them of the graveyard. And a man came out of the house, and he looked at that picture and goes, I know where that was. He goes, the people that guarded that graveyard stayed at my mom and dad's house when I was just a kid. And he marched us down this path, and where the graveyard was a house. A house had been built there. There was no Americans left there. So they built a house on the plot of land, and we were able to knock on the door, and UFOM spoke to the residents, and we were able to go inside their courtyard. And their courtyard would have been where the graveyard was. And we were able to pay respects on the last place that my father was in Vietnam, interred before he came home. That, my dad's remains, when they brought him back, had been dug up and reburied at least 2 or 3 times. Whether that was, he had been buried once after his death, and then a second time was when they moved all the men to the communal cemetery to be used as, and they were bargaining chips during the Vietnam Peace Treaty, which is why it took them a year to send the remains back after the war was over. It was very good to be able to pay respects at that site, not only for my father, but for the 23 other men that had been interred there for too long. It's not, ours is one story. There's hundreds and thousands of stories of loss from Vietnam. And that's what people need to remember. When I say my mom did this or my mom did that, especially with the League, yeah, she was the national coordinator, but she had 5,000 people working behind her, helping. It wasn't the time of computers. Everything was done either by letter or by phone call. To make a change like the League did was just amazing. One thing I neglected to mention was my mom did a petition to the United Nations and had it accepted when she was coordinator for the League of Families. They had tried to do one on the humane treatment of the POWs. Well, that didn't work because, torture was going on both sides. And in order to have it accepted, it's got to be accepted by a country willing to see that this is a valid reason. Mm-hmm. And but the one that was accepted was they were torturing the women and the families of the POWs by not allowing mail to go through. And after it was accepted, I believe it was accepted by Switzerland and presented to Vietnam. That's when men who were prisoners started getting packages. Oh. Letters started coming back and forth. A lot of people complain that the League did busy work. They made change. They really made change with the way that the Vietnamese treated the POWs.
Yeah. Did you know, is there a group of the 23 that died in the same cemetery as your dad? Did the families know each other? No.
No, we don't. But I am a member of a group online. It's called Sons and Daughters in Touch. It's a special group of Gold Star family members, mainly sons and daughters of men that had died in Vietnam. And that's my support, these people, they're my age or older, or a little younger. And it's just amazing what these sons and daughters have accomplished in their lifetimes. A lot of them are advocates for veteran groups. A lot of them do public speaking like myself, have written books, have gone to Vietnam. Some travel with the DPAA, which is an accounting agency, to try to bring men's remains back. Mm-hmm. They've gone with them and helped to dig and try to find their parents or their fathers. It's a really, really special group, and I would be remiss if I didn't mention them.
So the group's called the
Sons and Daughters in Touch.
Sons and Daughters in Touch.
Great group, great people. It's a private group. Mm-hmm. It's just for us, goes to our family members, and it helps us to, if we got having a bad day, if it's the anniversary of our loved one's death, that's where they can go and get support.
Yeah. They understand
Yeah.
what
Yeah.
you've gone through.
And yeah, we're there for them, and they've been there for me. The documentary that was made,
Mhm.
it's called The Fruits of Peace. Uh, the the name of the documentary, The Fruits of Peace, was penned by a Army Joint Chief of Staff to a Vietnamese officer, and he wrote that we often rush into war, but it seems that the fruits of peace come so much later. And it's so true.
Mm-hmm.
When I got back from Vietnam, uh, I hadn't been shopping in 3 weeks, needed some food for the refrigerator, went to our local shopping center. And when I was in Vietnam, I did what a tourist did. I was in Hanoi, and the lady was walking by with T-shirts for sale. And I picked up a T-shirt, and it said Vietnam across the top, and underneath it was a picture of a rickshaw. And I wore it to our local shopping center and didn't really think anything about it. I'd never been assaulted in Vietnam. Uh, but I was pushing my cart out to my car after shopping, and a lady ran up to me very angrily. How dare you wear the shirt of our enemies, waving her finger in my face. And I took a step, I was shocked and took a step back and proceeded to give her a little family history about why I would go. And her eyes got big when I said my dad was a POW, and I sort of gave her a little bit of why we would go, and then I finished with telling her that we've been at peace with Vietnam for almost 50 years. If we still consider them our enemies after almost 50 years of peace, all the men, women, and children that died in that war did so in vain. It's the soldiers' duty to fight for peace.
Mm-hmm.
And her jaw dropped, and she got tears in her eyes, like I am now. She said, "Nobody told me it's okay to let go of the anger." And my anger, I had to let go a long time ago. I didn't carry anger with me to Vietnam. If you carry anger too long, it eats you up on the inside. Either your health suffers, or you become an addict, or bad things can happen. You misbehave. My anger had left a long time ago, but seeing that woman brings tears to my eyes, because I know there are probably still people out there that are angry. Well, the men and women in Vietnam are like us. They just want their children to go to school and have food on the table. They're grateful that a whole generation has grown up without bombs falling on their heads.
Mm-hmm.
They're good people. They didn't, the men from the unit didn't have to do what they did. They did because family is important to them. Like I said, never once had a person come up and wave their finger in my face in Vietnam. I was shocked and dismayed to see it happen here.
Yeah.
But I understand. There's a lot of media that brought hate to the Vietnamese people. It's not the people of Vietnam that we should have feared. It's the government. The people of Vietnam, they were in a civil war. We were bombing their country. We backed the wrong person. A lot of people don't realize that Ho Chi Minh came to America first and tried to get America to make Vietnam one country again, not divided. We wouldn't even meet with him. So, the people of Vietnam are good people. Never had a problem with them, never will, north or south. They're just people like we are, want food on the table, want to be healthy, want to love one another.
Yeah. Yeah. People are people, you know?
Yeah. But you don't know, and in my circumstance, we didn't know. And not until we really got over there and got among the people. It was that was really a big surprising thing.
So did you feel a sense of peace after your visit that you
That's,
hadn't felt before?
yeah, one of my sons and daughters in touch members coined it best. It helped to chase the boogeyman away. You
Yeah.
know, the boogeyman is in here. Boogeyman does bad things to you, and it helped to give me peace. You know, we're the lucky family. We got my dad's remains back. We got closure a long time ago, but there's still something to be said about going there and being amongst the people and finding that they're just people. It does bring a lot of peace to you.
Yeah. You said your brother was a contractor. Did he serve in the military? Did any of your brothers serve in the military?
No, we had all the I had thought about it when I got to be the age and talked to mom about it, and she says, you really didn't have much of a childhood. You pretty much served for 8 years that your father was a supposed captive until he came home in a box. And she says, I think you've served enough. And I think all of my brothers and I, now that I'm my age, I'm 60, I sort of wish I would have, but at that time, I don't think I would have been a good serviceman.
Hmm.
But my brother Roland, he became a contractor, worked with Flora, and he wanted to go to Afghanistan. He felt he needed to.
Mm-hmm. Hmm.
He spent 11 years in Afghanistan. He was the second last plane to leave Bagram before it was overthrown by the Taliban.
Wow.
He's a lucky man.
Yeah. So is there anything that I haven't asked you about that you wish that I would ask you about?
Well, just wish that more people like my family would get the closure that my family did by like I said, there are 1,500 men that are still over 15. I think it's 1,581 that are still unaccounted for. My heart goes out to those families, and I say prayers for them that they'll get some closure. But having spoke with you, it's wonderful to do so. It's part of my healing process, and I hope it helps others to understand the meaning of sacrifice, patriotism, and forgiveness.
Mm-hmm.
That's what I speak about. You gotta to move forward. You have to forgive sometimes. You can't move forward if you have resentment.
Yeah. How did you feel about the family that invited you to Vietnam? They had the two brothers that fought for the North and the two brothers that fought for the South. Did you get any kind of feel of how that family came back together and dealt with the fact that they had been in a civil war together?
Yeah, when he came to America to see my his brother, they agreed not to talk politics.
Mm.
That's something that they still don't agree on. Yeah, would like my to go back to Vietnam and see their ancestral village, But my mom says that the only way I'll go back is when the tomb of Ho Chi Minh is destroyed. There's still not, they still love each other. They're still family, but they were on the opposite sides of a terrible battle. Uh, I've got to say, the men of Vietnam that we met, the members of the C4 anti-aircraft unit, they left their homes and traveled with us for 3 weeks. They never asked us for one penny.
Hmm.
They invited us into their house to meet their children and their families, which is unusual for that culture, to invite strangers into the house to meet the family. They treated us very well. They were good people. UFOM and the brothers, North South, they still love each other, but they have disagreements about their political
Affiliations.
Correct.
Well, I'm sure there's way more to cover, but I feel like we did a pretty good job today. And I thank you so much for your time and for giving us your memories of your father and telling us about your family. And
Well, you're welcome. It's like I said, it's a healing thing. I think it's an important discussion to have. A lot of people think sacrifice means you don't get a cheeseburger today.
Yeah.
It's sharing stories that help people grow, help the people acknowledge sacrifice and patriotism and forgiveness. And I think what you're doing is a remarkable thing to help people to remember people like me and my dad and my mom and the 58,000 other men that didn't come home. I want to thank you.
Oh. I have one more question. Just thought about it.
Sure.
You have obviously been to the Vietnam Memorial in DC. Can you remember the first time you went and how you felt? And if you can, is it an emotional experience? Do you go regularly, or you live in Florida, so you probably don't go regularly, but.
No, I don't go regularly. Actually, the first time I saw a Vietnam Wall was here locally when it came to Wickham Park.
Mm-hmm.
In 1989. I hadn't been back to Washington, D.C. since my dad's funeral, or since we moved to Florida. Traveling when you're young and just starting out, it's just sort of out of my financial situation.
Mm-hmm.
I said, well, I'm going to go see the Vietnam Wall here when it's in my town. I didn't really think I was going to be affected as much. I found my dad's name, hit my knees, and couldn't talk, couldn't see, couldn't walk for about 10 minutes.
Mm.
But this year, when the wall came to Wickham Park, I was a keynote speaker. Healing takes a while. First time in Washington, D.C. was at my mom's funeral. We went up where had my mom interred in Arlington with my dad. And me and my brothers and our family, we visited the wall. And by that time, we had done the wall here, and so it wasn't as hard hitting as if we hadn't seen it before.
Mm-hmm.
We knew which panel he was on, and it's always, believe me, it's to family members, it's always a moving experience to go to that wall. Mm-hmm. It's the names. When, it's the men's names, but being a family member, I think about the families behind the men's names. how many brothers he had, how many sisters did that man have, his family. It's by the time you think about that, you got to realize that most everybody in America either knew somebody or knew somebody who knew somebody who had died in that war.
Mhm.
It's a monument that I think will strike the heart of most family members.
Yeah. It's the size, I think, that really just gets you, and that how dark it is. You know what I mean? Like that it's just the wall is so.
And a lot of people don't realize it starts on 1 East, and it goes big down to small, and then it goes all the way to the west side from small to big. So where the wall starts, the war, it's a chronological order.
Mhm.
1 East is the beginning, and then the very west part where they meet is the end of the war.
Mm.
A lot of people don't realize that. They think it's just names thrown up there, but there's significance to the design of the wall.
The way they're listed.
Yeah, my father was panel 4 East, line 97.
Mm. So
and
you,
which,
sorry.
which was, very beginning of the Vietnam War.
Yeah. But how does the moving wall work?
It's a small replica of the Vietnam Wall.
Oh, okay.
It's brought on. We have the traveling Vietnam Memorial Wall. He's one of two that are a nonprofit, not for profit. They utilize the funds paid to get the wall from place to place. There are some walls, Vietnam walls, that move that are for profit,
Mm-hmm.
which is fine. The for-profit ones, you can actually have your own wall assembled and buy it.
Wow.
Yeah, it's sort of sacred to us family members. You wouldn't think that thing would be for sale, but it is.
Yeah.
The traveling memorial wall is the one that I go to, and they do such a great job. It's run by vets. They're all vets. Most of them getting older. What they really need, tell the people, please, is they need the younger generation to come out and help.
Mm-hmm.
These men that are moving this wall around the country for the benefit of everybody are being assembled and moved from place to place by these Vietnam vets, and they're all 70, 80 years old, if not older.
Mm-hmm.
They're not going to be able to do this forever. They need the younger vets to come in. These guys have set up not only the wall, but they've set up organizations to help get you guys the help you need.
Mm-hmm.
You don't go and help these guys help you, you're going to lose it. You lose the benefits. The government will take it from you. These organizations that are run by these Vietnam vets need the younger guys to step up. They really do.
Yeah. I guess it's kind of.
If there's one message that I think is really important as far as the wall goes, it's that
Mm-hmm.
you younger vets, guys, come on. You need to come and help these Vietnam vets, please.